Just give me that book.
Could George R.R. Martin's publishers force him to finish The Winds of Winter? Is there some kind of pressure they can exert to make him focus on finishing the books?
You don't have the cards.
It's a question that comes up quite often in my comments section. And to answer it, we first need to understand a bit about how the publishing industry works and the likely contractual situations between George R.R. Martin and those publishers. The Song of Ice and Fire series has several publishers. For example, Penguin Random House in the US and HarperCollins in the UK. But for simplicity's sake, I'll mostly refer to these collectively as publishers for this video. When the books were first pitched to agents and publishers, the plan was that it would be a trilogy. And generally, even today, if you take a fantasy story to a publisher, they'd prefer to do a 3-book deal rather than just the first novel. So let's assume that's what happened. Those publishers would have paid him in advance. An advance is where a publisher gives you some money right away for the rights to publish your book. If the book ends up selling enough copies to pay back the advance, then you start earning royalties, which is an amount per each copy sold. Today, for a relatively unknown author, the royalties would be about 10% of the cover price of the book, and an advance would be about $10,000 per book. Martin had a few published novels already, and if a bidding war broke out, he could have negotiated more. But as we'll see, this would still be really negligible compared to what he might negotiate today. According to a Guardian interview with a HarperCollins executive, his publishers only expected to sell 5,000 hardbacks and 50,000 paperbacks during the initial run of A Game of Thrones. A first edition hardcover cost £17 in the UK, and the paperback was £7, which is about $20 and $9 respectively. That means around $500,000 of revenue, of which Martin would have taken about 10%, or around $50,000 for the first book. Quite quickly, Martin realised he'd need at least 4 books to complete the story, and according to that same article, his publishers were pretty happy about that. So they would have immediately extended the initial contract to cover that extra book. As the books were doing better than expected by that point, the advance would have probably been bigger for the extra book, and the royalties would have likely been higher than the original 10%. By the time Martin was writing A Feast for Crows, he realised he needed at least 6 books, and then 7 when Feast and Dance got split into 2 books, which is still where we are now. At each stage, the publisher would have paid George R.R. Martin a bigger advance and higher royalty percentage for the extra books as the series got more and more popular, and his bargaining power increased. The Game of Thrones TV show debuted on the 17th of April 2011, and Dance released soon after on the 12th of July 2011. The series had, by that point, sold 12 million copies across all the books, about 3 million copies per book, which is obviously many times higher than those initial estimates for A Game of Thrones. If the average price per copy was the same as it had been for A Game of Thrones, that would mean that each novel had generated a huge $26 million, and Martin would be getting a much bigger percentage as he renegotiated his contract over time. I'd guess that at this point, Martin would have been taking about 30% of the revenue, about $8 million per book, of which around a quarter or $2 million would have probably been paid as an advance. This is really important for understanding the position that George R.R. Martin's publishers are in today, because the more successful an author and a series become, the more money that author can demand up front as an advance for each instalment. As we've already said, at the time Game of Thrones hit the screens, the books had sold around 12 million copies in total, but after the show became so popular, this skyrocketed to 90 million copies across the 5 books. That means each book has averaged 18 million copies, 6 times higher than when Martin would have extended his deal to cover books 6 and 7. Using the same maths as before, each book in the series is now worth around $160 million in revenue, and Martin could expect an advance of around $12 million if he announced a new book. So before we get on to whether his publishers could do anything to force George R.R. Martin to finish The Winds of Winter, we need to distill out a few important messages from all of this. 1. George R.R. Martin has made his publishers almost $1 billion in revenue from the 5 main series books published to date alone. 2. This is way more than they expected to make back in, let's say, 2004, when Martin was writing Feast and the contract was extended. 3. This means his publishers would have bought an asset in the Winds of Winter publishing rights for at the very most a $2 million advance, which would now probably be worth a $12 million advance. That is a great deal. So now let's do a couple of thought experiments to see if his publishers could force George R.R. Martin to finish The Winds of Winter more quickly. There's 2 ways they could do this. The first way they could do it would be to threaten to cancel his contract and ask for the $2 million advance back. If they did this, George R.R. Martin should be delighted, because he'd lose $2 million, which sounds like a lot, but would then be free to walk across the road to any of the other big publishers and get paid $12 million instead. In fact, as he already works with several big publishers already, he could probably play them off against one another, create a bidding war, and improve his deal even more than that. From his publisher's point of view, this would be an absolute disaster, because even if Martin dropped dead having never finished The Winds of Winter, they could probably still make their $160 million in revenue from packaging up and selling the unfinished manuscript, having only paid a $2 million advance. By terminating the contract, they lose all that money. So, if they can't cancel Martin's contract, could his publishers threaten to sue him? That's their second option. There is some basis for this in law. They could claim that by not finishing the book he was contracted to, Martin was denying them the profit they would have made on that $160 million. Perhaps they could even sue him for the profit they're losing on Dream as well at this point. This is called suing for damages, something you've lost as a result of someone else's actions or inactions. The problem is, could they really convince a judge that they had incurred damages as a result of Martin's actions? After all, they paid advances of between $10,000 and $2 million across the 6 books that they would have paid advances for to date. But they already earned $160 million per book and almost $1 billion in revenue in total. What's more, Martin could fairly argue that all his non-book writing activities that distracted him from finishing Winds were the exact reason the publishers had made all this money. After all, sales of the current books increased 6-fold from 12 million to 90 million copies based on the success of the TV show he had been working on. So would publishers really try and threaten George R.R. Martin with suing him? Probably not. He'd be in a strong position to call their bluff, and that would mean the publishers risking a lot. They'd risk losing an expensive court case. It would risk having to terminate the contract, losing all the profit on Winds. It would risk really annoying a lot of their customers, George R.R. Martin's hardcore fans. And a really important point, it would risk ruining their relationship with George R.R. Martin, which despite the delay on Winds is still making them a lot of money, not just on the continued sales of the mainline books, but on the World of Ice and Fire, Fire and Blood, novellas, cookbooks, and any other side projects Martin can offer them. So can publishers do anything to force George R.R. Martin to get the books finished? Other than politely asking? Probably not.
You don't have the cards.
His publishers have made and continue to make a huge amount of money from their partnership. And in the worst case, if he dropped dead tomorrow, they could publish the unfinished manuscript of The Winds of Winter for hundreds of millions of dollars. And by being the exclusive publishers of the whole series, they'd also be able to produce hugely profitable collections of all the books for decades to come. In short, no one is going to force George R.R. Martin to do anything. All us fans can do is hope he's working hard on The Winds of Winter and find some inspiration soon.
I make joke.
Just like I can't force you to click like, subscribe, or leave a comment, but I really hope you do. And until next time, keep writing.